Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 202. So today, we are going to talk about Adam Smith, and specifically, we're going to talk about his book, The Wealth of Nations. And this is going to be kind of a long slideshow, and a long lecture, and I apologize for that, but I will put an intermission in the middle. So, let's get started. So let's start by talking about Adam Smith. So he is one of our authors who, although educated, was not wealthy, so that's a nice change. He was Scottish, and he was born to an educated father, but his father actually died before his birth, so he was raised by his widowed mother. So he went to Oxford and he went to the University of Edinburgh, but he largely financed his education with scholarships. So primarily we think of him as an economist, mostly because he kind of invented modern economy, but he was also a philosopher, and he also worked for a long time as a tutor, which is basically following rich boys around their European tour, which sounds like a great job. So, one of the things that I think is really interesting about Adam Smith was that he had kind of an outsized impact for just one individual. So this is a list of things that he basically invented, and some of them you'll notice are huge. He basically invented the field of economics as a field of study. He was one of the first people to talk about the free market system, basically just leaving the market alone to do what it will. He didn't precisely invent the division of labor, but he was one of the first people to popularize it. And he also was one of the first people to really talk about rational self-interest. So he was a very logical guy, and a very sort of not feelingsy guy, but he had a huge impact in terms of how he thought about the economy impacting the social world. So he was one of the first people to think about the way that jobs impact everything else. So if you like capitalism, you're going to like Adam Smith. So we are focusing on Smith's piece, The Wealth of Nations, or more accurately, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So this book came out in 1776, a big year, and it's considered one of the foundational pieces in modern economics. It's kind of a required must-read for almost all students of economics and, of course, core students. But it took Smith a really long time to write. He basically worked on it for 10 years, and he was editing it right up until his death. Even though it's a classic now, it was also a bestseller at the time, which interestingly was kind of a surprise to people, and I wanted to show you this quote because I think it's funny. But basically one of the booksellers at the time was surprised that people wanted to read this book. And he said, "It sold more than I could have expected from a work that requires so much thought and reflection, qualities that do not abound among modern readers, to peruse to any purpose." So even at the time, people were saying that the young people, they're too flighty to understand this, and they were surprised that people wanted to talk about economics. And then again, here we are, so many years later, still talking about this book. So we are focusing on Book 1, which has this marvelous title, Of the Causes of Improvement in the Productive Powers of Labor, and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people. What a title. So we're going to focus very specifically on Chapter 1, which is called Of the Division of Labor. A little bit simpler. So here is the primary thought, the sort of thesis statement of this whole section. The greatest improvements in the productive powers of labor, and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment of which it is anywhere directed or applied, seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. So that's a huge part of what we're going to talk about today, this concept of the division of labor, and how it really changed the way that we make products. So let's get into what that might be. Here is a simple explanation. The assignment of different parts of a manufacturing process or task to different people in order to improve efficiency. So I think one easy way to think about it is if you go to Chipotle. Very often, the same person does not make your entire burrito. The same person does all of the meat, and then the next person does all of the veggies, and then the next person does the cash register, and so on. So basically the concept behind the division of labor is that you break a really complex task down into several simple tasks. And there are a lot of benefits to doing it this way, some of which Smith will enumerate for you now. So as an example of how the division of labor works, Smith offers the making of pens. So here he's talking about the kind of pens that you would use for sewing. So he says that if you were making each pen yourself in its entirety, this is what you would do. You would have to draw out the wire, and then you would have to straighten it, and then you would have to cut it, and then you would have to make it pointy at one end, and then you would have to make it flat at the other end, and then you would have to put on the little top of the pen that's round, And then you would have to paint the pen white, and then you would have to put the pen in the paper, and basically doing each one of those steps in order yourself would take forever. It would be much more efficient if you got a whole team of people together, and one guy just drew the wire over and over, over and over, and the next person put the little wire in straight lines over and over, over and over, etc. So you can see where he's going with this. Basically, if you take a complex task and break it down into small parts, it's much easier to do it that way. So here are some of the benefits that he talks about. Basically, it makes it go fast. The division of labor, however, so far as it can be introduced, occasions in every art a proportional increase of the productive powers of labor. So essentially, if you do it this way, you can make more stuff. You can do it fast, and that's what we love, right? Doing things fast and getting more of it. So this is a pretty compelling argument. If you're going to manufacture things, you want it to be fast, and you want it to make as many as possible. So Smith goes on to sort of explain how this works, but I've made it into this very beautiful graph for you. Basically, if you employ the division of labor, you make easier jobs, which makes it easier to train people, which makes it easier to hire people, which means there are more jobs for everybody. So instead of like taking on an apprenticeship where you learn the whole craft from beginning to end and you train for 15 or 20 years, you just do one thing. And we can train you to do it in like 10 or 15 minutes. And in fact, we can train anybody to do it. And in fact, we built this whole factory, come on in. So basically, by breaking the products down into the division of labor, jobs for everybody. A win-win. So next, just to drive his point home, Smith talks about some of the benefits of the division of labor. And I love these because they are so common sense. And yet, the way that he explains them is a little complex, so let's go through each one. So the first one is the dexterity of the workman. And the argument here is essentially if you do something over and over and over, you get so good at it that you get really fast and really precise. So as an example, dumplings. I'll post a video for you of people making dumplings because I just think it's fascinating to watch somebody who's really good at it. Because it's deceptively hard to make a little dumpling, but if you make 100 dumplings a day, and then 100 dumplings the next day, and then 100 dumplings the next day, and you do that for 10 years, you get real good at dumplings. Another example would be that you don't have to get distracted by switching between tasks. This one hits a little close to home. A man commonly saunters a little and turning his hand from one sort of employment to another. When he first begins the new work, he is seldom very keen and hearty. His mind, as they say, does not go to it, and for some time he rather trifles than applies to good purpose. You may be familiar with this one. Sometimes when you switch from one task to another task, you get a little distracted. You forgot what you walked across the room for, or your phone starts going off and you want to look at it, or you see something shiny, or you just start daydreaming. And so his idea is that if you're not constantly shifting your focus, you're able to sort of like laser focus in on something. This makes good sense for those of us with short attention spans. The next one is just that machines are amazing. My favorite thing about this part is that he says he doesn't even need to explain it. Everybody must be sensible about how much labor is facilitated and abridged by the application of proper machinery. It is unnecessary to give any example. Which, like, okay, but maybe it is unnecessary. So for instance, you could cut an egg into perfectly beautiful long way slices with a knife. But if you needed to cut a lot of eggs into a lot of slices, it really would benefit you to have this egg slicing machine. So basically, even if a thing can be done without machines, sometimes machines do make it go faster and more precise. The final thing is that sometimes you end up with a surplus. And that means you can start to trade with other people. Every workman has a great quantity of his own work to dispose of beyond what he himself has occasion for. And every other workman, being in exactly the same situation, he is able to exchange a great quantity of his own goods for a great quantity of theirs. So essentially, it's kind of like working in the food court. And I don't know if you guys have had this experience, but very often, if you work in a restaurant that is next door to another restaurant, you trade. Because as much pizza as you can eat doesn't mean you're going to be in the mood for pizza every night. So you start trading with perhaps the Chinese restaurant next door because they don't want any Chinese food either. So basically your surplus is something that someone else wants, and their surplus is something that you want. So you work out an active trade until all of you get to eat new food every week. This one makes sense too, right? The final example is that this requires a lot of people to participate. So even though the division of labor does make things go fast, it is important to recognize how many people are required to make it go fast. If we examine, I say, all these things, and consider what a variety of labor is employed about each of them, we shall be sensible that without the assistance and cooperation of many thousands, the very meanest person in a civilized country could not be provided the easy and simple manner in which he is commonly accommodated. So basically, one way to think about this is to think about the shirt that you're wearing right now. So how many people do you think were involved in the making of your shirt? Somebody had to harvest the materials, somebody had to turn those into thread, somebody had to operate the machine that made it into a woven fabric, somebody had to make the fabric into like shirt shapes, somebody had to sew that together, somebody had to package it, somebody had to ship it, somebody had to put it out on the shelves if you bought it in a real store. So basically thousands and thousands of people actively come together for every single product we use. And this is also common sense, but one of those things we don't always think about. So basically, in short, the division of labor requires lots of people, but it enables us to make lots of stuff, and to do it really quickly. So now we come to chapter 2 of the principle which gives occasion to the division of labor. So this part can get a little bit repetitive, so we'll go through it kind of fast, but basically he's trying to explain why we love the division of labor so much. So he starts by going all the way back. The division of labor, from which so many advantages are derived, is not originally the effect of any human wisdom. It is the necessary, though very slow and gradual, consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. We don't really use the word truck like this anymore, but it basically means trade. So what he's saying is that we didn't invent the division of labor on purpose, so much as we began to employ the division of labor because we love trading. So he basically argues that we are mutually dependent in a way that other animals aren't. And this is kind of an interesting argument, because he's basically saying we have to employ the division of labor because we can't do everything by ourselves. In almost every other race of animals, each individual, when it is grown to maturity, is entirely independent, and in its natural state has occasion for the assistance of no other living creature. But man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. So basically he's saying that, like, a cat out in nature could probably feed itself and be fine, but a child out in nature, or even really a grown adult, might not be able to. And we can't expect other humans to help us just because they feel like it, of their benevolence. So instead, we get other humans to help us by helping them. We divide the labor. So he gives the example of bartering, which is true, humans love bartering. Give me that which you want, and you shall have this which is what you want, is the meaning of every such offer. And it is in this manner that we obtain from one another the far greater part of those good offices which we stand in need of. So this is old-fashioned language, but basically he's saying we all know how to barter, and we love bartering. We understand the concept of, like, I have this thing, and I will trade it to you for this other thing that I want. He says that basically this kind of trading is how we got to the division of labor. So we started by trading things that we needed, food, medicine, and we escalated to trading labor and jobs. As it is by treaty, by barter, and by purchase, that we obtain from one another the greater part of those mutual good offices which we stand in need of, so it is the same trucking disposition which originally gives occasion to the division of labor. So again, very similar to the way that we were like, I have some extra potatoes, I'll trade you for some extra milk. We get to things like the chore wheel. We all want the same thing, a clean house, but we will trade who does which chores so that one person doesn't have to do all the chores. He then goes on to talk about how this lends itself pretty easily to specialization. Basically, if it turns out that you're really good at one thing, that can be the thing that you barter. So instead of having to learn a range of skills, you might just get really good at one thing, but you're so good at it that it has value to other people too. And thus, the certainty of being able to exchange all that surplus by the produce of his own labor, which is over and above his own consumption, for such parts of the produce of other men's labor as he may have occasion for, encourages every man to apply himself to a particular occupation, and to cultivate and bring to perfection whatever talent and genius he may possess for that particular species of business. So if, for instance, you are extremely good and fast at crocheting, like this amazing little boy, you might find that it's a good use of your time to spend all day crocheting, because you can trade those blankets for things that other people spent all day making. So the division of labor lends itself really easily to specialization. His final thought, and sort of his thesis statement, is here. Each animal is still obliged to support and defend itself, separately and independently, and derives no sort of advantage from that variety of talents with which nature has distinguished its fellows. Among men, on the contrary, the most dissimilar geniuses are of use to one another. The different products of their respective talents, by the general disposition to trunk, barter, and exchange, being brought, as it were, into a common stock, where every man may purchase whatever part of the produce of other men's talents he has occasion for. So it's kind of a whole wall of text, but basically what he's saying is that it's okay if the thing that you specialize in is different than the thing that someone else specializes in, because ultimately that's going to be a huge benefit. And you should just pursue the thing that you're really good at, because you are bringing that value to the table. So if you are really good at milking cows, but someone else is really good at turning that milk into butter, that's okay, because with your forces combined, you're useful. So basically, division of labor, very helpful. Specialization, also very helpful. And it's normal for humans to want to trade. Chapter 2. So now we come to Chapter 8 of the wages of labor. So here Smith is addressing an ages-old question. Who should benefit from the labor that you do? So first he takes it all the way back, and he says that the original person who benefits from the labor is the person who did it. The produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor. If you start with all of these ingredients and do the labor to make them into this dinner, you get to eat the dinner. The natural wages of labor belong to you. However, it starts to get a little more complicated. In that original state of things, which precedes both the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer. He has neither landlord nor master to share it with him. So again, if you own the land, if you are this carrot farmer, all the carrots are your carrot. But you'll notice that he introduces something new, the landlord. He argues next that basically if it's not your land, it's simply not your profit. But this original state of things, in which the laborer enjoyed the whole produce of his own labor, could not last beyond the first introduction of the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock. So if you own the land, you keep the profits. If you don't own the land, a whole different system develops. So now that we have the accumulation of stock, we have the accumulation of land, profits get a lot more complicated. So basically he asks, okay, well then where does this profit go? If it doesn't go directly to the laborer, who does it go to? And basically he breaks it down into three things: rent, wages, and materials. So let's look at each of those in turn. So the first place your profit goes is paying rent. If you don't own the land, you have to pay the person who owns the land. As soon as land becomes private property, the landlord demands a share of almost all the produce, which the laborer can either raise or collect from it. So the simplest version of this is that if you are farming the land, but someone else owns the land, you have to give them a percentage of what you farmed. The next place it goes is into wages. It seldom happens that the person who tills the ground has the wherewithal to maintain himself until he reaps the harvest. His maintenance is generally advanced to him from the stock of a master. So if you're paying people to work for you, or even if you're paying yourself to work for yourself, you have to take into consideration that there might be times of feast and times of famine, especially if you're actually growing crops. There's only a certain time of the year when you get to reap the harvest. The rest of the year, what are you supposed to do? And so Smith says one of the places that profit goes is in paying out steady wages over the course of the year to all of your laborers so that they don't have a bunch of money at one point and no money at the other point. The final place, materials. In all arts and manufactures, the greater part of the workmen stand in need of a master to advance them the materials of their work. So depending on the job, you might need somebody else's stuff to be able to do it. You might be an amazing bulldozer driver, but if you don't bring a bulldozer with you, you're going to need to go somewhere where they already have a bulldozer. And this is true of most jobs. You need the things that they have there to do the job. So you have to make supplies so that your workers can do their jobs. So basically, your profit is eaten up by paying for the land on which it sits, paying your workers all the time, and buying the things that you need to be able to do the job. So the profits are no longer straight to the laborer, they're kind of spread out. So that brings us to one of the most timeless questions of all: how much should people be paid for their work? And Smith says, kind of depends on who you ask. What are the common wages of labor depends everywhere upon the contract made between those two parties, whose interests are by no means the same. The workmen desire to get as much, and the masters to give as little as possible. An ages-old truth, right? The people who are doing the labor would like to get as much pay as possible. The people who are paying the laborers would like to pay them as little as possible. But one thing that Smith points out, which is pretty sharp, is that this does have a lot to do with power. So he notes that it's not difficult to foresee which of the two parties must, upon all ordinary occasions, have advantage in the dispute, and force the other into compliance with their terms. So even though there's a natural sort of dispute, the workman wants as much as possible, the owner wants as little as possible, the owner generally has the benefit. So basically, because the owner has more power, usually what ends up happening is they pay as little as possible. Does everyone like this arrangement, you ask? No, they do not. One of the things that Smith talks about is the extent to which people have protested in order to get the wages to be higher. This is also an ages-old practice. The former, the workmen, are disposed to combine in order to raise, the latter, the masters, in order to lower the wages of labor. So it has long been common for the workers to come together and try to use their power as a group to get more pay. However, it has also long been common for the masters to come together as a group and use their power to keep that pay down. The masters, being fewer in number, can combine much more easily, and the law, besides, authorizes or at least does not prohibit their combinations, while it prohibits those of workmen. So even hundreds of years ago, they made laws to try to stop people from unionizing. And even hundreds of years ago, it was easier for the masters to get together and decide on a sort of a wage gap than it was for the workers to get together and decide on a wage increase. So, part of this, he argues, has to do with a kind of tacit agreement among the owners that they are going to try to keep the wages as low as possible. Masters are always and everywhere, in a sort of tacit but constant and uniform combination, not to raise the wages of labor above their actual rate. What their actual rate is, of course, fluctuates, but essentially he's arguing that they are always, all together, trying to keep it low. We seldom indeed hear of this combination because it is the usual and one may say the natural state of things, which no one ever hears of. So it's not like we hear reports of them getting together and arguing that they should keep the wages as low as possible. It's just that we're pretty sure that this is something they do on the down low. One of the problems with this is that the owners can do this because they have wealth in the bank. So they can afford to hold out. If the workers do go on strike or if the workers do protest, very often the owners can just kind of sit back and chill because they can pay next month's rent and they can pay next month's bills, but the workers might not be able to. A landlord could generally live a year or two upon the stocks which they have already acquired. Many workmen could not subsist a week. Few could subsist a year and a month, and scarce any a year without employment. In the long run, the workman is as necessary to the master as his master is to him, but the necessity is not so immediate. So one of the things that gives the owners power over the workmen in terms of how much they should pay is that the owners can hold out, whereas the workmen might be living paycheck to paycheck. So they might have a greater need to kind of get this solved as quickly as possible. He then starts to talk about the way that people have been protesting for so long, and he sounds a little bit annoyed by it, but it's interesting. Workers sometimes combine of their own accord to raise the price of their labor. This is kind of like going on strike. Their usual pretenses are sometimes the high price of provisions, which is to say the cost of living. Sometimes the great profit which their masters make by their work, which is to say the owner getting a huge profit while the workers get no profit. In order to bring the point to a speedy decision, they have always recourse to the loudest clamor and sometimes the most shocking violence and outrage. They are desperate and act with the follow and extravagance of desperate men, who must either starve or frighten their masters into immediate compliance with their demands. Basically, the practice of striking and the practice of protesting and the practice of going to the press to tell them about how bad your job is, none of that is new. Workers have been doing this since there have been workers. But the owners have been squashing this since there have been owners. So there is again a very long and in some ways a very proud and beautiful history of the workers rising up and making the loudest clamor in order to get attention, in order to make their working conditions better. These kind of strikes and these kind of protests are the things that gave us the 5-day work week or the 40-hour work week, or the right to take lunch breaks. If these workers hadn't raised that kind of clamor, our lives would be a lot worse. But Smith points out that clamor also exists on the other side. The masters, upon these occasions, are just as clamorous on the other side, and never cease to call aloud for the assistance of the civil magistrate. The workmen, accordingly, very seldom derive any advantage from the violence of these tumultuous combinations, which generally end in nothing but the punishment or ruin of the ringleaders. So Smith acknowledges that basically, even though the masters are fewer, they have direct ends with the police, don't they? So it's easier for them to sort of squash the rebellions, and it's easier for them to punish and ruin the people who were the ringleaders. And this is why people are often slow to join a union, or reluctant to join a union, because the people who are promoting the union often get fired, and because the police might come in and break up your protest. So it can be dangerous to protest against low wages. Historically, it has been super dangerous, and that's why you usually don't see it unless things are really bad. So again, this sort of contest between how much people should be paid has existed forever. So now Smith begins to address the concept of a minimum wage. And this is not the minimum wage that you're probably thinking of. This was kind of a different idea of what a minimum wage should do. So here's kind of what he thinks. A man must always live by his work, and his wages must be at least sufficient to maintain him. They must even, upon occasions, be somewhat more. Otherwise, it would be impossible for him to bring up a family, and the race of such workmen could not last beyond the first generation. So basically, he's starting to say you have to have wages enough to maintain yourself. However, if we want more workmen to exist, if we want the next generation to come up, you might need wages enough to raise them. So the minimum wage, Smith argues, is not for one person. The minimum wage is probably for one man, his wife, and at least 2 children, so that those 2 children can replace them in the workforce. But also, childhood mortality was pretty high at this point, so Smith does question whether, in fact, it should be one man, his wife, and 4 children, just in case 2 die, or, if they live, more workmen for everybody. So his concept of the minimum wage is basically enough to support a guy and his family, not just a guy, because we need to ensure that more workers are forthcoming. He does put a little bit of thought into how much a minimum wage should be for a slave, but he dismisses it because he's not sure he's even supposed to pay slaves, and that part was dumb, so we'll skip it. But the idea here is basically the minimum wage should be enough for a family, which is not an idea that we kept with. So another interesting thing about the minimum wage is that you might be forced to raise it because of circumstances outside of your control. This scarcity of hands occasions a competition among masters, who bid against one another in order to get workmen and thus voluntarily break through the natural combination of masters not to raise wages. So essentially, you might have two competing forces: how many jobs you have and how many workers you have. I've made a very beautiful graph to help us understand it. Basically, if there are a lot of workers competing for a few jobs, you can lower the wages on the jobs, because there's so many people competing that they'll take whatever they can get. But if there are a lot of jobs and not very many workers, then you're going to have to raise the wages, because the workers can pick and choose what jobs they want. So for the most part, the owners have the advantage, because usually there's more workers than there are jobs. But if there are more jobs than there are workers, the workers have the advantage. So basically, the pay goes up and down depending on the scarcity of jobs and or the scarcity of workers. It's a little bit complicated, but it's just basically a seesaw, so I'm sure you understand. So next, Smith comes to a very important concept: profits are good. So what he does in this section is to kind of outline the ways in which the profits can benefit everybody. So first, he talks about how profits can create new jobs. If you are the master and you start to make profits at work, you might hire more servants for your house. You might even hire more employees. If you are the workman and you own a place and you start to get profits, you might hire more employees. So basically, the more profits, the better, because it means more jobs. However, the next part is a little bit more complicated. And the next part, he argues that more profits are better on the whole. The demand for those who live by wages, therefore, necessarily increases with the increase of revenue and stock of every country, and cannot possibly increase without it. The increase of revenue and stock is the increase of national wealth. The demand for those who live by wages, therefore, naturally increases with the increase of natural wealth, and cannot possibly increase without it. So basically, as individuals get richer, the nation gets richer. And as the nation gets richer, the individuals within the nation get richer. So it forms this sort of cycle in which, as people begin to make money from their jobs with wages, they begin to spend it in ways that create more jobs that have more wages, which creates more jobs, etc., etc., etc. So as the nation gets wealthier, so too do the people within the nation get wealthier. Wealth of nations. It's a little bit complicated, so I made us another very beautiful graph. Basically, the division of labor creates more jobs. Once you have more jobs, you can create more personal wealth, because you're getting, the proceeds from doing those jobs. Once you have more personal wealth, you can create more jobs, because maybe you open your own business. Once you've made those more jobs, that leads to national wealth, because the individuals within the nation are getting wealthier. Which leads to, you guessed it, more division of labor, more jobs, more jobs, more jobs, more money, more money. So basically, the division of labor creates jobs, and then that profit cycles around, and cycles around, and cycles around, and cycles around. Rousseau said it with this very nice paragraph. It is not the actual greatness of national wealth, but its continual increase, which occasions a rise in the wages of labor. It is not, accordingly, in the richest countries, but in the most thriving, or in those which are growing rich the fastest, that the wages of labor are the highest. So the richest countries might just have a few people at the top and everybody else at the bottom. And he's saying that's not the wealth of nations. The whole nation becomes richer when the people within the nation are becoming richer. All the people at all the different levels. So he says really the best way to make a strong country is to have lots of jobs at lots of levels, and to have basically everybody in your country gradually accumulating wealth. Wealth of people, wealth of nations. Smith wraps it up really beautifully with this statement, in which he also considers the plight of the poor. The liberal reward of labor, therefore, as it is the necessary effect, so it is the natural symptom of increasing national wealth. The scanty maintenance of the laboring poor, on the other hand, is the natural symptom that things are at a stand, and that their starving condition, they are going fast backwards. So he is saying basically, if you have a whole bunch of starving poor people in your country, your economy isn't good. So basically, if you want the whole nation to be wealthy, the people at all the different levels need to be wealthy, not just the people at the top. A shocking economic theory. So now that we've agreed that we should pay people for their wages, and we probably should pay them a minimum price, we have to also think about what might affect those wages. Essentially, should we adjust the wages to circumstances? And Smith says yes. So here are some of the circumstances he thinks that we should consider. The first, summer and winter. Again, he's thinking kind of agriculturally here, but his argument is that sometimes we have a lot of wages like in the summer, and sometimes we have very few wages like in the winter, and that's not ideal. So he says that basically we should even out the wages over the course of the year so that people aren't low on wages right when they need them, like for instance during the winter when they need fuel. Pretty logical. The next thing to consider is the fluctuation of prices. So Smith notes that basically when the cost of provisions go up, which is essentially how we talk about the cost of living, wages don't also go up. I know, a shocking revelation. But he argues that basically the same amount of money might not purchase the same amount of goods if those two things don't match. So he says that basically we should adjust the wages to match what we need to live. Then he talks about how wages might vary across locations. And this is always true, in part because the cost of living is different in different places. But this can also be true on a really small scale. He noted that sometimes people who are doing the same job but in different places don't receive the same wages. So if you think about, for instance, waiting on tables. Even though kind of it's the same job no matter where you work, if you work at Waffle House, you get very different wages than if you work at, let's say, a cute little diner, than if you work at, let's say, a Black Apron restaurant. So basically, the wages of the labor that you're getting paid can differ dramatically depending on what kind of place you're working in, but also depending on what location in the country you're working in. So here's another example. This is basically a map of how much teachers make in every state. So again, even though they're doing roughly the same job, they're not necessarily being paid the same amount. So in this, you can see that in some places they're getting more than $70,000, but in some places they're getting less than $50,000. So yes, this is adjusted to the cost of living. It just costs more to live in California and New York than it does, for instance, in Mississippi and Alabama. But at the same time, it's a great example of the way that wages aren't consistent across the same job. Here's another example. This is the average salary of nurses per state, and you'll notice that it matches pretty closely to the other one. In California and New York, they make more money than they do in, like, Tennessee and Kentucky. So the wages of the labor do differ based on what season it is, based on how much things cost where you are, and he thinks that that's important, and we should adjust the wages to account for these differences. I should point out, though, that Smith notes that this does not always match. Sometimes the wages of the labor do not match the cost of living where the job is taking place. So Smith noticed and wrote down, and we are still talking about, the way that sometimes the wages just aren't enough for where you are. So again, as an example, here is a map of the relative cost of living based on the parity. So basically, how much does the cost of living, equal out to on average, and then how much more expensive are some places. So you'll notice that the places that are in red are extremely expensive, and the places that are in dark blue are not very expensive. So Georgia is a really interesting example of this, because we have a lot of places where the cost of living is relatively low, and then there's Atlanta. Here's one more example. This is the hourly wage needed to rent a 2-bedroom home in every state. So if you were working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and you were only paying 30% of your income on housing, which is what they recommend, this is how much you would need per hour to buy a 2-bedroom house, to rent a 2-bedroom house. And again, you'll notice that it varies dramatically depending on where you are, with California and Hawaii being the most expensive. So again, Smith's basic argument here is that wages should match cost of living, but they don't always. So finally, Smith addresses a very important question. Should we pay people more than the minimum? But what improves the circumstances of the greater part can ever be regarded as any inconveniency to the whole. No society can be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. So this is kind of a shocking argument, but basically he's saying if the majority of the citizens in your country are poor and miserable, your country is not doing great, and in fact you should improve it. So he goes on into a little bit more detail. First, he notices that even though we think maybe it should, poverty does not reduce birth rates. Poverty, though it no doubt discourages, does not always prevent marriage. It seems even favorable to generation. A half-starved Highland woman frequently bears more than 20 children, while a pampered fine lady is often incapable of bearing any, and is generally exhausted by 2 or 3. Yeah, I don't know. But I think basically what he meant was that you would think that people would refrain from getting married and having babies if they were really poor, and he's kind of shocked to find out that they don't. I don't know how to explain this to Adam Smith, so I'll just leave it there. He also notices that even though people in poverty are having babies, poverty is not good for babies. But poverty, though it does not prevent the generation, is extremely unfavorable to the rearing of children. This is true. It's bad to raise babies in poverty. It doesn't go well. Therefore, the reward of labor must necessarily encourage in such a manner the marriage and multiplication of laborers. So basically, if people are going to be having all these babies anyway and getting married anyway, we should probably pay them enough to do so in a healthy manner. Indeed, if we want the economy to continue to grow, we need a bunch of workers. And if we want a bunch of workers, we need people to get married and have a bunch of babies. So essentially he's arguing that the best way to drive the economy forward is to pay people enough to get married and raise healthy babies. It's a kind of a big picture view of the economy, and again, one that we have largely ignored. He also argues that if you pay people a little bit more, they might actually do better work. The liberal reward of labor, as it encourages the propagation, so it encourages the industry of common people. The wages of labor are the encouragement of industry, which, like every other human quality, improves in proportion to the encouragement it receives. So seriously, he's arguing that if we pay people more, they'll do better work. That they'll feel more industrious, they'll feel like they need to work harder, and they'll make more stuff. So not only will they make more babies, they'll be more productive at work. Smith also wonders if paying people better might encourage them to be more healthy, and if the act of being more healthy might in fact make them better workers, creating a nice little cycle. A plentiful subsistence increases the bodily strength of the laborer, and the comfortable hope of bettering his condition, and of ending his days, perhaps, in ease and plenty, animates him to exert that strength to the utmost. So his argument is basically that well-paid workers are probably healthier, and people who would like to work until they retire and retire happy and healthy might work harder in anticipation of that goal. A lot of people worry that paying too much might make the workers become lazy. That essentially, if they don't have to work as hard as possible for as little money as possible, they might get kind of complacent. Smith says that's not the case. Where wages are high, accordingly, we shall always find the workmen more active, diligent, and expeditious than when they were low. And this does kind of bear out with personal experience. I imagine you've seen people working minimum wage jobs who did not look happy to be there. You might have also seen people working high-wage jobs where they did seem happy to be there, and they were working as hard as they could to earn their money. So this is kind of an interesting statement. A lot of people worry about this, but Smith thinks higher pay will lead to better work. He also thinks, and this is very scary, that maybe they should get breaks. Great labor, either of mind or body, continued for several days together, is, in most men, naturally followed by a great desire of relaxation. So he's saying that basically when people work hard, they would also like to rest, and that allowing them to rest will enable them to come back and work hard again. So, shockingly, even though he is basically the father of capitalism, Smith thinks that paying the workers well will ultimately lead to benefits that will make you more money. So in summation, basically, the division of labor means we can make more stuff faster. When we make more stuff faster, we have more stuff to trade. So as a society, we just have more things that we might need. It also argues that employers have a little bit more strength than workers. Usually because there's fewer employers than there are workers, so the workers are competing and the employers don't have to compete. But that can be reversed. And finally, that well-paid workers are actually happier, and they're healthier, and they work harder. They also go on to have more babies, which can go on to replace them. And it's important to remember that Smith sees this all as part of a really big picture. that well-paid workers contribute to the economy, which makes the economy stronger, which makes the nation stronger. And that having well-paid workers at each sort of segment of the economy makes the economy stronger as a whole. So even though his ideas about capitalism did lead to some questionable choices, he did also argue that working in favor of the workers would make the company itself stronger, and thus the nation stronger. So, I am looking forward to talking about this with you. We're all going to be economists next week. I'll see you then. Let me know if you have any questions.